Towards the end of the 2000s, horror had once again started to shift. The era of grisly, grimy torture porn movies was beginning to fade. And after the success of Paranormal Activity, the more stripped-back, PG-13 Ghost Train-style horror movies were starting to become popular again. However, that wasn't to say that there weren't still a few outliers. Some movies that felt like a last hurrah for that nu metal era of horror. In 2009, Saw sequel writers Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan made a horror film called The Collector, about a deranged, masked killer invading a family's home to murder them all with violent, bloodthirsty traps. The film was described by critics at the time as an ultra-violent mashup of Home Alone and Saw. A few years later, in 2016, Fede Alvarez followed up his blood-drenched Evil Dead reboot with a home invasion film called Don't Breathe. Don't Breathe had plenty of that pared-down, heart-stopping tension that we'd come to expect from horror of the 2010s, but it was mixed with a kind of grisly OTT abduction and torture horror, which felt like a throwback to the heyday of the nihilistic 2000s.
There's nothing a man cannot do once he accepts the fact that there is no God.
Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of home invasion, and we discuss 2009's The Collector and 2016's Don't Breathe. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Munzer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in the middle of our 9th season, exploring the evolution of home invasion, and this is part 24. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, we're going to be looking at two nasty, grisly movies from the late 2000s and 2010s. That's The Collector from 2009 and Don't Breathe from 2016. Both of these discussions will, of course, be spoiler-filled. Please give them a watch before you listen to our discussion. So joining me to discuss these two gloriously nasty little films, I've got a long-time friend of the pod and a very good friend of mine, as well as being, until recently at least, one of my regular Fresh Blood co-hosts over on Patreon. She was last here on the main podcast discussing Salem's Lot with me, and she's got a brand new, very exciting job that she's going to tell us about now. Welcome back, Louise Blain. Hello, Louise.
Hello, Mike Munzer. How are you?
I am so good. It feels like it's been a long time since me and you chatted here on the main podcast, right?
It has been. I was trying to even think when it was. We've done so much fresh blooding.
Yes, we've done so much stuff over on Patreon, which everyone should check out if they haven't already.
Mm-hmm.
I think the last time it would have been the last series, which was our vampire series, and it was Salem's Lot with Stevie, I believe, right?
Even then, we had to share.
So the last time it was just me and you talking about a movie was probably The Mist the year before that. So it's been a long time.
It's been a really long time. I mean, I forget because we speak every day. And also, speaking of The Mist, when's that new edition coming out?
Is it the start of October? About that. So excited about that. Yeah, absolutely cannot wait. How are you, Louise? You've had an exciting year so far, right?
Yes, I have. It's been very ludicrously exciting, and I think I've been exploding on fresh blood every time that we've talked about it. I'm like, I can't say things. So obviously, I've stepped away from Fresh Blood as a regular contributor, although I'm sure I will haunt your ears at points. You won't lose me that easily, get away from me that easily. But yeah, I have joined. I just can't, even saying it out loud is mad. I have joined Blumhouse Games. So I don't know if anyone doesn't know. Back earlier in the year, Blumhouse announced that they are also, as well as the film and TV space, in the gaming space as well. And I've been hired as the creative lead for Blumhouse Games. So I'm part of the leadership team there, and I work with our partners to help bring their creative visions and their games to life. So it's really, really exciting. Really exciting.
Incredible. This is so exciting that you're part of Blumhouse now. This is absolutely amazing. Congratulations, Louise.
Thank you.
I am sad to lose you from Fresh Blood, but I'm so pleased for you. It's so cool. And yeah, I imagine there's not much else that you can really tell us about in terms of what you guys are doing and working on right now, right? But it's super exciting.
No, it's so exciting. I mean, I'm helping the company sort of identify and vet potential partners, looking at lots of different things. So it's really, really exciting. But I also have to say that obviously our next however many hours we're going to discuss these movies are my opinions only. These are not the opinions of Blumhouse or Blumhouse Games. They are mine. I will own them.
I love it. That's what we like to hear. Some more lovely Louise Blain opinions, right? This is what we're here for. But that's so amazing. Congratulations again. Like, no one deserves it more than you. It's so cool.
Thanks, Mike.
Now let's get bleak, Louise, because I'm going to ask you about home invasion.
Let's do it.
It's quite a divisive subgenre compared to most of the others we've covered in the history of this podcast, it feels like. Yeah. What are your thoughts on it? What do you think of home invasion?
So I think I struggle with home invasion movies. I think a lot of people do. I think the idea of, and I think you've covered it in lots of the previous episodes, is the fact that this is a much more human horror. This doesn't have the safety of supernatural. This doesn't have the safety of monsters. This is the idea that humans will do horrific things to each other. And obviously our home is our happiest, most snug place where we feel the most secure. And the idea of humans coming in there, not invited, and doing what they will is a genuinely terrifying concept. I think I struggle with the home invasion genre. But I like, as we're going to discuss in this, subverted home invasion movies, the You're Next. As long as people can somehow take revenge or twist these expectations, then I feel much better about it. But, stuff like Funny Games, etc., is absolutely not my bag. I find it excruciating to watch. In that way.
No matter how dark and disturbing horror gets, most horror movies give you a kind of catharsis, right?
Yes,
whereas
it's a release.
Funny Games and The Strangers, there's not a lot of release, right, in those movies.
And the thing is, like, I think I can deal with Strangers slightly better, but only just because it uses such interesting ways to scare you. I think I watch horror, and I think a lot of people watch horror for that roller coaster ride and for that sense of catharsis. And obviously you and I have talked a lot about Stephen King's horror, which is very full of heart. We talked about The Mist, which obviously has a tremendously bleak ending, but has a human story at its heart. And I think suddenly when humans become cold, calculating, malicious and vindictive, which is what people in home invasion movies tend to be, I struggle. I really, really struggle, because as much as non-horror fans think that horror fans are gorehounds, we're actually really very cuddly and very, very sensitive. So
Agreed. Yeah, and I think it's one of those subgenres, isn't it? I think we all know at the back of our heads that a slasher scenario, a ghost scenario, a whatever scenario is very unlikely to happen to us. Yes. Whereas the home invasion thing, it's like, oh, this is feasibly a thing, right, that could happen and has happened to people. Have you ever experienced anything like that of any kind, Louise? A kind of a break-in or a home invasion at all?
Sadly, yes. Which is why I really can't cope with a lot of them, and the fact that when I was younger, where I lived, we had numerous break-ins, and the last time there was a break-in, we found an axe in my bedroom. So whoever it was had come in armed.
Fuck.
And you never quite know whether someone comes in armed because they're scared, or whether they come in to scare people, or whether they would be happy to cause harm, or whether that was used as a tool, but coming home from a break-in where you have, all of your stuff is gone, and then finding that it's a lot, and I think these kind of I think break-ins leave scars because you don't feel safe. And we had a guard dog at the time, and they shut her in the room that she'd been in. Oh, God. So a German Shepherd didn't fix it, And I think for a long time you just don't feel safe. Yeah. Where you are, it just doesn't. Nothing feels safe, and I think it really it actually changes my attitudes to home invasion. That talk about later, because
Yeah.
I tend to think that people sometimes can deserve what's coming to them, and now I'm much older. That's what I used to think. It happened when I was a teenager, and when you're a teenager, you're just angry and you're like, bah, they deserve this. And it's actually obviously massive societal issues, and crime is a societal issue, and everybody has a justification for what they do, and nothing is morally black and white, as we will discuss when we discuss Don't Breathe. But I think it's certainly a triggering sort of genre for me to use that word. It's not, I don't normally use that word, but it's certainly something that I think about, and you can't help thinking about, and seeing the reactions of parents and family and all of that, having to take, because it's a minefield to go through.
It is. It really is, actually, because I think that is such a kind of violation, isn't it? I think having your kind of personal space invaded in that way, and it's just the idea of it, isn't it? I think, of like, you think to yourself, what would have happened if I was home? Would anything have happened? Would nothing? Like you say, the psychological minefield, I think that gives you is horrible.
And there's a weird feeling, and the thing is, and it's very good because it's only things, isn't it? We're very fortunate when something like that happens and you're broken into and people have just stolen stuff, but there is a kind of weird feeling that you get as you look around, being like, what is gone? What have people taken? What are the gaps sitting on your desk?
Yes.
And
yes,
you're very, very glad that it is just things, and these go through insurance companies, and that's fine, and you're not harmed. But I think there's definitely a very weird sensation of being a teenager and going into your room and being like, well, what's gone?
Oh, God.
It's a horrible, horrible thing.
Yeah, it really is. And I think, do you think that the way we think about our own home has kind of changed in the last couple of years as well, since everything that's happened around the world in 2020 onwards? I feel like people's relationships with their own space and their own home has intensified in one way or another, I think,
Yeah, we spent so much time there. And I think that's also like, I think that's something that obviously Rob Savage and Jed Shepherd and Gemma Harley really took advantage of with Host, and the fact that, yes, it was a supernatural one, but it brought the horror home when all we had was home. So I think bringing things closer to home now, to a place that we feel safe and that we are fortunate enough to have and feel safe, is definitely something that I think has changed. And I think we always like a place to feel secure, don't we? We like a place, but then I think when we spent so much time there, I don't know about you, but after the pandemic, I found I struggled to go out again. Because it was like, well, it's raining, I'm not going to go out. And suddenly you're like, previously on me, I would never have not gone out because it was raining. But now I'm like, well, I'll get wet. And it's like, that's just what used to happen. Yeah,
it's weird, isn't it? It's like a weird mixed feelings of you feeling kind of sick of being indoors and sort of wanting to get out, after that couple of years. But then also there's this added kind of slight agoraphobia almost from everyone, I think, isn't there? There's this slight kind of anxiety of I kind of want to get out of my house that's kind of kept me in prison for the last 2 years, but also I sort of don't want to at the same time,
Yep.
Yeah.
It's safe in here. It creates
exactly.
Especially when we were obviously fighting against an enemy we couldn't see,
right?
When we felt very at home because we were literally safe.
Yes, indeed. So we are going to talk about stuff that's a little bit more fun and frothy than that, though, right?
Yes,
I mean,
thankfully.
nasty as anything, but also quite fun and cathartic, I would say, right? So we're gonna rewind back to, our favourite era, Louise. We love to talk about the 2000s. We're rewinding back to the 2000s for, I think, possibly one of the most 2000s movies I've seen in a very long time, right? Which is The Collector from 2009.
Jesus. No. What does this guy want? What does he want? He collects people. He's killing people. He's killing them. No. He only kills people that he doesn't want. The rest he takes. Dude, why are you here? On the bait. If you're not chosen, you'll never leave this house alive. You're the sixth one! You're the sixth one! No!
Well, The Collector is about a man. He's a handyman, and he has been working on a house. He's been helping out with a house. But his wife, or I couldn't quite decide if it was his wife or his ex-girlfriend, the mother of his child, or whether he was still in a relationship with her. Quite confusing. There was a kiss, no idea.
Yes.
But she owes money. And in order for her to be safe, he needs to get her money. And the only way that he can think to get her money is to break into the house that he has been helping. He knows it's empty. He knows there's something in the safe. So he goes that night to get the thing out of the safe, only to discover that someone has got there first. And that someone is the Collector, whose motives we will discuss, but who has effectively turned the house into Home Alone meets Jigsaw.
Yes.
And he must therefore try and escape this house, and try and save as many of the inhabitants who it turns out are still there.
Yes. Home Alone meets Saw is the perfect way to describe this insane film. Now, I don't know how, but this movie has completely passed me by until this point. When I announced I was doing a home invasion movie, various different listeners and friends of the pod were like, oh, you've got to do The Collector. And I'd never seen The Collector. I wasn't aware of The Collector. And yeah, so I've seen it twice now in prep for this recording, but this was the first time I had watched The Collector. What about you, Louise? What's your history with this film?
This was the first time too.
Yeah. How did this pass us both by? What were we up to in 2009? We must have been busy.
We must have been busy in 2009. Yeah, I genuinely, I know that it went from 2 different distributors, but it still went out in the cinema, and it obviously then still had a home release, and obviously was successful enough to then create a sequel, and I think a third one that is kind of stalled in production. But yeah, I didn't know this existed. Although I had, I think, seen the cover. I think I'd seen that art of that weird sort of sack head. And I think that I had wrongly assumed or put it into just kind of that pile in my head, like the kind of the pile that I potentially would never get to. You know, that we have a priorities list, obviously.
We do.
And I didn't think that would make it, but it should have, really.
Yes. What did you think of it?
So it's weird. I've now watched it twice again in preparation for this. And the first time I watched it, I actually had a load of fun with it. Loads of fun. When I watched it yesterday, it must have been the kind of mood I was in. I found it significantly more bleak and depressing and depraved than I had the previous time. So I've been on a bit of a roller coaster with it. Both times nasty. The first time significantly more fun. Maybe I'd had more caffeine or something, because yesterday I was like, oh, this doesn't mess around. It really doesn't mess around.
It really doesn't mess around. But I'm the same as you. I have a kind of mix of those feelings that you just said. I watched it and I was like, fuck me, the 2000s were nasty and grimy and gross, weren't they? And this movie is nasty and grimy and gross. It's quite mean-spirited. It's super violent. It really does feel like the sort of horror movie we don't get much anymore. But it's sort of so ludicrous that I laughed throughout the whole thing, right? I had a lot of fun with it,
I had a ton of fun. There was a point where bear traps rocked up, and I was like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. I'm having fun. But then I felt bad about it. I felt
actually, there is stuff about it where I'm like, oh man, like I was talking to a friend, Sarah Dobbs, who is a great kind of horror brain and horror expert, and I said to her, what do you think of The Collector? And she was like, she said, I think that's the one that's got like horrible stuff happening to animals in the film, right? And she was like, I've never watched it. And I was like, yeah. And obviously, like, just to say it's not real animal harm, but there is animal harm towards dogs. And there's a really gross scene towards a cat.
Horrible bit with a cat. It's really horrible.
And I get, actually, it's like what you said. I'm like, oh, actually, this film is really fucking horrible in a lot of ways. But I think because it's so over the top, it's like what we were saying about horror and that catharsis. And, you know, last week I discussed The Strangers. This is not The Strangers. Like, this is not like, oh, a really, really dark, almost believable situation. You know, this was just like, it is almost a cartoon at points, you know?
And it requires, it requires such... The idea that when he enters, that obviously this is going to be a massively spoilerific podcast.
Oh yes, we'll go full spoilers.
Yeah, when he enters the house the first time to go to the safe, it looks all perfectly normal. He doesn't, encounter any razor wire or fishing hooks on wires or nails or any of those things. He makes his way up the stairs. By the time he comes back down the stairs, the place is littered with traps, like littered with traps that would take the kind of architectural planning documents of years.
Oh my God. It's like a kind of Acme, like Wile E. Coyote kind of series of traps, right? It's ridiculous.
Strings connected to wood, connected to nails, connected to this. And it's, okay, sure, it's kind of got that mousetrap feel, deathly mousetrap. It's kind of,
100%.
The whole place has been scaled for it. So, I mean, that's, I guess, where the nice ludicrousness is, because it's like, well, this is all impossible. This is...
Exactly.
And it's also elevated by its very sort of nature as he wears a mask. He looks gross. He kind of positions himself like a little weird golem with glowing eyes at one point. Like, regardless of its gross nastiness, it's quite heightened in a sort of comic book way.
Totally.
With some very weird zooms and weird focuses on mouths and eyes in quite a comic book style as well.
Well, and it's directed in that, James Wan, Darren Lynn Bousman kind of a way, like the Saw movies. We'll talk about its relationship with Saw, I'm sure, in a minute. But it has that kind of frenetic camera work that the original Saw and its sequels had, right?
Yep.
That is just insane. Where it's like you're watching a new metal music video, right? And it's definitely got that vibe to it. I think it's really interesting. The mask is something that's really interesting. This is what we talked about last week with The Strangers too. That there is something that makes The Strangers slightly more palatable than Funny Games. And I think the masks do that. Suddenly it lends a vibe of like you're watching an American slasher movie. It's genre. It's not just two horrible men, and that was kind of the first true home invasion movie that utilized masks, The Strangers. And then off the back of that, we get movies like this, which is like, it pushes it even further into genre, where it's like, okay, I can handle this because it's just a bit of silly fun, basically. Yes.
Absolutely.
But let's talk a little bit about that, about what came sort of before it, because we've talked about this together before, Louise, probably mainly on Patreon. I think when we did, we covered things like the Saw movies. But what are your thoughts on this era of horror that we were sort of coming to the end of by the time The Collector happened, right?
Yeah, we were coming to the end of it. So I was doing I was looking at dates and stuff because it's quite nice to kind of see the journey of it. So I mean, we're sitting at this in 2009. Hostel had come out in 2005.
Yes.
So we'd already had 4 years of people sitting screaming in chairs with empty eye sockets, So by this point, we had Cloverfield in 2008. We had Wreck in 2007. Paranormal Activity came out in 2007 as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, we had Orphan 2009. So we were going in a different direction where people were kind of going, actually, we're not going to just have green lighting and black blood.
Yes.
We're going to take this in a different direction. But this is almost firmly digging its heels into the noughties. 2009, it's almost the 2010s, but it's not quite. So this was like almost like a last hurrah of this kind of horror that actually was very much on its way out by the time this came. Totally on its way out.
Absolutely. It's like almost this style would have felt a little bit dated by this point, right?
Gone.
5 years after Saw, because it really is doing that Saw thing. And you're absolutely right. We were on the brink of a new kind of horror. Like next week, me and Josh Tonks are going to be talking about Your Next from 2011, right? And that very much feels like it brings the home invasion into this new 2010s era, right? Yes. Where everything's a little bit more fun, a little bit more throwback to the 80s. It's got a different vibe to that grungy new metal.
There's an awareness. It's almost like we grew an awareness. Horror kind of took a step forward, and they went, well, actually, we know you're watching this for this, but actually, if we can subvert your expectations somewhat, if we can still thrill you and shock you and scare you without stitching someone's mouth together, let's try that.
This movie, it did begin life as a Saw sequel. It was going to be a kind of, I think the original concept for the script was going to be that this was going to be like a story, like a prequel story of Jigsaw's childhood, and this happened to him as a child, in that someone invaded his home and killed his family in this like horrific series of traps, which kind of attempts to explain the pathology of like why he is the way he is, right? I love that. And obviously it became very much its own separate thing, but the writers that made this did go on to do a bunch of Saw sequels. I think they wrote Saws 4, 5, 6, 3D, right? You know, so all those sequels.
Shout out to 6.
Yeah, love it. Can you feel that this, you know, kind of started life as a Saw movie or a Saw concept?
Yeah, it's got that DNA, doesn't it? I think that's also why we find it so fascinating. And I think we found Saw exceptionally fascinating because, as disgusted as we were, the idea that things were constructed specifically for death are compelling.
Absolutely.
Right? As disgusting as that sounds, you know, we're watching, you know, stuff like Escape Room, etc. now, which is slightly more sort of cartoonified, but we like that. Like these are compelling concepts and compelling high concepts that we like exploring because we can get a kick out of the fact that something's designed that way and we can be appalled by it. And I think the idea that it's then been constructed inside someone's house, where the place that you're meant to be safe, it turns the house into a trap. So all you want to do is get out. And I think I've realised even through watching both The Collector and Don't Breathe, these are movies that are obsessed with locks, keys, and doors. Absolutely obsessed. Just obsessed. These are cat and mouse, hide and seek, locks and key obsessed. Because innately, all you need to do is get out. That's
exactly that.
That's it.
It's booby traps, it's locks and keys, and it's vicious dogs. That's what these movies are. So many dogs.
I think we've grown out of that too. I think I put in the note. I was like, what is this obsession with bad dogs? Like, it's not very. I mean, in 2023. The fact that we've got when did Does the Dog Die start?
Right, exactly.
When did that start?
Yeah.
Because we have a lot of understandable reverence for our furry friends that they've just decided to make evil. And I quite like the idea that these will be lovely, peaceful stunt dogs that they've managed to make bark like this when actually they'll just be a total cuddle fest.
I know, I love it so much. There's nothing I love more than when you see a quote-unquote ferocious dog running around attacking someone in a movie, but actually its tail is wagging and you're like, actually that dog is having the most lovely time just wanting to cuddle whoever that actor is, you know, but they've added in post all these like growling and snarling. It's so good. Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? We don't get a lot of that anymore. That goes back to films like The People Under the Stairs, which we talked about a few weeks ago. Both these movies actually feel like they owe a lot to The People Under the Stairs and Home Alone, of course, as well. Home Alone, a movie which some people found controversial that I covered in this home invasion series, but you can see the DNA of Home Alone in so many horror films that came since, you know, this is the thing.
I don't think it takes much, as you've said, to kind of twist Home Alone to a horror.
Yeah.
You know, the idea of these guys getting hit with full paint cans and irons and being exploded. Yes, it's, again, as you say, that sort of Wile E. Coyote cartoony equivalent of that. But they are inherently horrific. And when you're young, you watch that and you find it horrible and funny. And really, The Collector is just it's horrible and it's funny. And I do
you're right. It's kind of the adult version of the feeling that you get when you watch Home Alone, which is that you kind of go, you kind of squirm, but you also laugh at how ridiculous it is. And that's kind of exactly how I reacted to watching The Collector for the first time last week, you know?
Yeah.
And I know that some people have a problem with this label of torture porn. You know, in a way, it's just a good shorthand to talk about what sort of film we mean.
Yes.
And I do think that this film fits that. And I think, you know, I don't think that the original Saw is torture porn. I think its sequels are. And I think the Hostel movies are. And I think this movie feels more akin to the Saw sequels and the Hostel movies than it does to the original Saw. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And I also think that so much so-called torture porn that people kind of labelled, I understand. I mean, you and I have watched, especially at various festivals, we've watched a lot of movies that kind of, they don't earn their violence, and I think that's where the question comes in, isn't it? Is where do you earn your violence? Where do you earn your depravity and your vindicativeness? Are you going to justify this? And I think The Collector neatly dodges that, and also maybe even Hostel in a way of it's exploring a high concept, and the high concept of The Collector is let's make an indoor mousetrap where humans are pincushions, you know? And I think as long as you can justify, I mean, I'm not saying that there is perfect films where you can justify everything, but I do think that if you put it in this package, it will be a far more palatable experience, as bleak as it is.
Absolutely. And this is, again, kind of like with The Strangers, especially with the Strangers sequel, actually, this is where we're really on that blurred line between home invasion and slasher, to be honest. It's, in a lot of ways, this movie is a traditional slasher. You've got a masked maniac. You've got characters dying in kind of gruey but entertaining ways, left, right, and centre, where really you're not so much interested in the characters and the relationship between these characters. We don't really care. We're there to see the traps, the gore, the kills, the torture, whatever, right? That's sort of where this movie gets its entertainment value.
And I do think if you're sitting, with on a Friday night and you're that kind of perfect, let's put on a horror film.
Yes.
It sits in that very sort of entertaining, proper, like physical, the kind of moments like in, when The Quiet Place or something becomes obsessed with a nail.
Yes.
These shrink and are perfect.
Mm-hmm.
The Collector, it has barrels of nails. It has chandeliers of knives, and I think that's the kind of thing that you're not thinking about these tiny focused body horror. You're having to think bigger and wider and sharper and gorier.
We've talked about this. We've touched upon this already, really, but let me ask you about Marcus Dunstan's direction in this film and just the way this film kind of looks, its visual style, its general vibe. How do you find it?
Do you know, I love an opening credit sequence, especially in a horror movie.
Oh my God, the 7 opening credit sequence.
Yep, yes, it has such a vibe to it. Yep. It is like a music video. And it's also, again, very noughties. There's loads of like quite slow motion pans through woodlands and some focuses on spiders, and it feels very...
Yes.
I was there for it. I was there for that kind of weird contrast with the needle sharp, this rope leads to this thing that means that this will snap, which means this is going to get gored. Those two things are like a massive contrast. So I was surprisingly like, this is, there's a moment where he goes into a club and Depeche Mode is pounding. I was like, sure. Yeah. I mean,
there's a bit of Bela Lugosi's dead during a sex scene in a kitchen, which again, I'm like, do we need this scene? I don't know, but brilliant. Sure. Love it. I'm here for it. Yeah. Absolutely incredible. I agree. I think the direction's fun. This was his directorial debut. As I mentioned, he had written Feast, Saw 4 and Saw 5 at this point, so he was kind of very much in the horror genre. This was his directorial debut, and I think directorially this movie is pretty good because you do need a sense of geography, you need a sense of space, you need a sense of what the fuck am I looking at here, where we're zapping around from one trap to the next and watching one thing lead to the next, and if that doesn't work, none of it would work, right? I think you need to feel what is going on from scene to scene coherently for you to understand that these people are walking into rooms and setting off various traps, and this causes this and this causes this, etc. And
then there was a couple of times where when he's just arrived in the house, the camera goes up.
Yes.
And there's that top-down shot where it becomes kind of a game. And there was an extreme long shot that was top-down earlier as well. If you can justify a top-down shot, great. I'm here for it. And that fully justified it. That idea of positioning, as you said, that exact positioning was great. Was here for that.
As with most home invasion movies, 99% of the film is all set in a house. So much of the production design in the house itself is important. Interestingly, Louise, when reading up on this, I discovered that this house in Louisiana, at least the exteriors of it, it's the same house as Texas Chainsaw 3D. The one that most people hated that me and you had quite a lot of fun with. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do remember. This is amazing.
That big kind of Louisiana house in the middle of nowhere. Yeah, that mansion. Yeah, but what do you think of the house itself and the way it's kind of, the center of the horror in this?
Well, see, I love it because it does... You end up learning the geography of it, as you say. But as it starts pushing through, you start going down the holes in the walls. You find out that things can go from A to B, and you find out that you can fall out of this window, but actually you'll be somewhere else. And I think that's also something that's going to be in the next movie we talk about too. It becomes an exercise. It becomes a bottle episode because the simplicity is you just need to get out of the house. Why is that so hard?
Yes.
So I love the use of the house. I think it becomes, you begin understanding it as someone begins going up or down the stairs, and suddenly you're like, well, there was a trap there before, and why have you not been in this room? I mean, it's the same as so many movies where you're like, how does this house have all these rooms?
Right, exactly. It's very Saw 2, actually, isn't it? Saw 2
Yes.
with that kind of house of traps that they can't get out of. Yeah, I agree. I love it. And, you called it a mansion. It is fucking massive, right? And we get enough establishing shots of the outside of the house to really tell us this house is huge. Therefore, I'm kind of happy to go along with the fact that there are endless rooms after rooms and corridors and secret passageways and stairs and windows that drop onto various other places. And like you said, a huge labyrinthine sort of basement. And because that house looks so massive from the outside, I'm sort of like, fine.
Fully believe.
Fully believe.
Yep.
Yeah, it's great. Although, as we've already mentioned, how did he prep this house? I mean, that's the biggest question I think everyone has, right, coming off the back of this movie. Is like, how on earth did the collector rig this house up in time with these
Impossible. And I think that's the nice thing. That's the reminder of, like, there's one point, and I think it's one of my horrible favourite kills, when I don't even really understand what's happened, where the girl grabs, like, some scissors and all of a sudden is, like, catapulted onto the screen, which has covered in knives. And it's like, well, this is literal. This is literal. I love how literal this is. She's just been splatted onto the screen that's full of butcher knives. And it's got this level of, again, like, even the outline of her kind of splayed is kind of like when Wile E. Coyote is fired through a rock.
Right.
It is that level of absurdity.
Yes. Absolutely. And actually it makes that violence less sort of less horrific, really. Absolutely. In a way. Like, we've talked about this together before, but the kind of smaller, more relatable injuries, I mentioned Saw 2. As everyone knows, the most horrific scene in Saw 2 is the needle pit, right? Yes. Because you go, oh my God, I can feel what that would feel like to have a syringe in me and to have multiple in me, and it's a horrible, horrible scene. Whereas, the more extreme the deaths get in the Saw movies, the more you go, okay, this is fine. Again, this is cartoon. And most of them in this movie are pretty cartoonish. Although, I tell you what really gets me, when he reaches through the window and the razor blades kind of cut his fingers, as he's trying to get out of the boarded up windows. That is horrible.
The bit I had before was the needle in the inside of the phone. Oh, when I saw that, I was like, oh God, this is awful. Because, it's those little moments. So the needle inside the phone, the fingers through the razor, and they happen like 2 seconds after each other, which also lessens the horror, because, again, it's like a series of unfortunate events, Saw style, really. Yes. Because it happens within seconds, and he pulls his finger out of the razor, and then something else awful happens. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. And that needle in the telephone, again, you could absolutely have imagined Kevin McAllister doing that to the burglars in Home Alone, right? Yeah. Like, rig up the telephone with a needle so you can't use it. And, one of the burglars would give a comical sounding scream and fall backwards, and that would be fine, right? But yes, you're right. In this, it's a little bit more like, oh my God. Yeah. Horrific. I love it. So the characters, we should talk briefly about the characters in this. Yes. The main character of our first movie here, Arkin. What do you make of him as our kind of protagonist of this story?
I think it's interesting because, as we were talking at the introduction, like, we have to understand that when someone is going into he's breaking the law, he's making his own rules, he's decided to rob from these people. Yes. And the thing is, these people have given him some more money. The father gave him a bonus and said, buy something for your kid. And it was all very friendly and all very nice. And the idea that he then has justification morally to help his family to go back into the house and rob these people. I buy it. I buy his desperation to go in and do what he has to do. I totally buy it. And I found him much more entertaining and much more likable. Although I didn't appreciate the fact that the only insults he had for the collector were homophobic ones. It was a bit of that really, I was just like, I guess that's probably of its time as well. Yeah,
another absolutely quintessential 2000s thing about this movie is its constant use of the homophobic F slur.
It was just,
throughout
that was gross,
scene,
actually,
right?
And it was weird because I felt I was very aware of it, because actually it's something that is not a thing. No.
Oh, you'd never in a million years get that now, unless it was a movie about that, right?
Oh yeah, unless you're going to just,
it was doing something clever.
That's it. Unless you're doing something clever and you're going to subvert that, then just don't. So other than that moment, he spent most of it creeping around with very wide eyes, not saying tremendously much. trying to stop people from dying who then died. So
yes, exactly. But yeah, I think it's really interesting that you're right. The way that it, in both these, we'll talk about this with Don't Breathe too, right? The kind of the moral ambiguity of, I think Don't Breathe does it better, but this movie where we've got the guy that is going to break the law, he's going to do something bad, but we spend time with him at the beginning. He's nice to the little girl. He's got his own daughter. He's got his own family problems, right? And it's like, oh, this guy's desperate. Again, this is something we do see in a lot of these types of movies, all the way through to Parasite, of course, which is like one of the best and most prime examples of this, of the have-nots having to, get what they can from this kind of rich family, and you kind of think, well, fair enough, and I think this movie does quite a funny job of building him up to be this nice, well-meaning man versus the family that live in this house are a bit cartoony and caricaturish, right? The first, and again, I don't know, I'm not passing judgment on this myself, but I think the film is passing judgment on the fact that the first time we see the mum, she's like inserting Botox into her forehead.
She's Botoxing herself.
And she's being a bit mean to her teenage daughter, and her teenage daughter hates her, and they're all a bit like, they're a bit vapid and superficial, this family, right? And they have more money than they know what to do with, And again, the movie uses quite reductive, basic ways of showing us that, but I think it makes a point to show us all of that, doesn't it, at the beginning?
Yeah, it does do that, and I think it has to. I think it's kind of, like, it's like, well, look, these people are this is what these people are like. Look, we need to make you feel okay about what's about to happen next.
Yes, yes. And they're the MacGuffin that's in the safe, which is some precious rock or gemstone or something.
Didn't you think it looked like the Philosopher's Stone from As Above, So Below? I was thinking, oh, good, Nicholas Flamel hid it in this house. Great. It's not in the catacombs after all.
But yeah, it kind of does what we need it to do, right? I think in terms of the characters, that sequence in the bar with his daughter and everything as well, and his possibly ex-wife, I think.
Yeah, there was a kiss and I was confused. Yeah. But it was also like, it puts it in the realm of, like, he's walking through this smoky bar, these pole dancers, and then he gets into this car with this gangster. It exists in a world where gangsters exist in cars being threatening. It's almost like that heightened John Wick style universe.
And this is something that I did not clock until I watched it a second time. But the collector is the exterminator that we see at the beginning of the movie, right? Because this house is riddled with wasps. But we get a glimpse of the exterminator at the beginning, right? Wearing an exterminator mask. We don't really ever see his face. But so let's talk about him, shall we? What do we make of... What is his MO here exactly, Louise? Like, he gets hired to exterminate houses, then he goes in, rigs them with traps, kills everyone in the house, but leaves one alive and takes them with him? Is that what he does?
And puts them in his box.
Yes.
And then leaves the box in someone else's house. I think this is so the traps are so well rigged. That's the thing. Like, the traps are the thing.
Yes.
Like, he does the traps really well. But I don't really know what he collects and why he collects them. And maybe that's the mystery. Maybe that's the centralized mystery. Is I don't really know what he's doing. I know he's killing everybody and he's enjoying it, so maybe that's enough. And wearing a mask.
He's a real nasty, sadistic motherfucker, this guy, right?
Vile.
Isn't he? And it's a scary concept that he infiltrates a family's home, will murder all but one of them, and then kidnap another one and take him with him. Like, it's a very scary concept. But yes, we don't... That's not made completely clear to me. And again, like, because there's an opening scene where a previous household gets invaded, right?
Yes.
And then we see that man from that opening scene invasion, like you say, in a box, who kind of falls out of the box for enough time to give us this explanation of what this collector does, right?
Yeah. And it was funny because it's like, well, you don't really need to tell us that this guy's bad news, because poor Arkin has already got holes in his ears, not really got many of his fingers left.
Yes.
I can't remember if he'd been squelching about in the murder glue by that point.
Right.
But with his shoes all melted.
He must have quite the van of equipment that he has to drive around with him as well, right? This collector.
Yeah, that is a small van for all of those nails.
What do you think of his look as well? So I was reading that he had to wear 2 sets of contact lenses, one on top of the other, a black contact lens, and then on top of that, a kind of shiny mirrored one. And the actor, Juan Fernandez, as the collector, he basically couldn't see. Like, he was completely blind on camera. He was blinded by these 2 layers of contact lenses. So he couldn't actually, again, linking it to Don't Breathe, weirdly, he couldn't actually see anything that was happening while he was being directed in these scenes. But yeah, what do you think of him, his look and the mask and everything?
He's scary.
Really
I mean, that's
scary.
the thing. He is really scary.
Yeah.
I might not know why he puts people in boxes, but he's scary. And like, it's hard as well. I mean, I think by 2009... we've seen a lot of masks, you know, and I think we've seen a lot of masks, and I think finding an identity in even then of like who your next slasher icon is going to be is a real challenge. And I do think he's scary looking.
He's really scary looking. Like you said,
sort of rips around the face and the sack and
he looks properly monstrous, doesn't he? He looks not human, I think. I think it's the eyes that really finish off that look, isn't it? Because we've all kind of seen the sort of the sack head murderer. We've even seen that in The Strangers, but yes, there's something about those eyes that make him look truly monstrous. There is no, again, we'll talk about this, how it's different in Don't Breathe, of course, but there are no human qualities to this baddie. Like, there are not a single redeeming feature, right? He is an absolute pure monster. Like, there's nothing more to him than that.
Totally, you know? That. And there's a scene in the hallway when he's approaching the couple who had that comedic, it's so comedic, this beautiful dance where they're trying to have sex but have almost triggered all of these traps but don't quite do it. So it's like, it's amazing. It's this dance of this, but then it changes when they see him, this weird twisted, and he looks kind of like the way his eyes go is like a monster in The Descent. Like, he looks very striking.
Yeah.
But then when he's standing up, he's just this strange humanoid with a very small knife.
Yeah.
He's holding a little knife.
Yeah.
And that's quite interesting because a lot of the time we look at our slashers and, you know, you have Jason with giant machete, or you have Ghostface with a very iconic but very over-the-top, almost cartoony knife.
Yes.
You have your traditional villains, but actually he's just standing holding a little knife, but you have no qualms about the fact that he's going to murder both of them. Like, that's not even, it's not like, will they survive? It's a case of no, they will not. And I think that's really interesting, to be able to depict a villain that you know will win automatically, even though he's just holding a tiny knife. And it literally, the first moment he interacts with him, this guy puts his hand out and he just stabs him through the hand. There are no rules. Nothing. No rules there. And you can, it's a really interesting interaction, actually, when you think about it in terms of a slasher villain, because there's no chance. They are dead. They are
dead indeed, yes. And again, there is that slight element of the Jigsaw thing where you're like, oh, is he actually going to murder anyone by his own hands on screen, or is it all going to be the traps, right? But actually, he is that much more vicious than Jigsaw, even, in that he will absolutely go for you and stab you through the hand with a knife, or sew your mouth shut or whatever as well, right? And speaking of, shall we talk about some of the gore and some of the horror and some of our highlights when the horror gets going, right?
Yes.
I actually think that scene with the mother having her mouth sewn shut is brutal, isn't it?
It's really grim. It's really grim. And also there's screaming involved, and it's really horrible screaming that's almost like pig-like.
Yes.
Like, it's hot. It's very, very unpleasant.
Oh, God.
And it's all kind of performative for Arkin, because he's like, oh, I told you not to do this. It's like, well, you did tell her to scream.
Yes.
You know, and this is what's happening because she... Yeah, and there was also a bit with some pliers in the tongue.
Oh, I know. I was going to say, how did you cope with that? Because there's almost a bit of tooth. There's some tooth horror.
Almost. There's some tooth horror. I had to watch it twice, Mike.
Yes.
I just kind of disassociated for a couple of minutes. It was just like, and just drift.
Just drift. It is. It's like it goes through the whole handbook, doesn't it? Of like, what other body parts now have we not covered yet? We've done fingers, we've done nails, we've done teeth, we've done eyes. Yeah, it is like, it will get you everywhere in this movie.
Yes.
That is a particularly nasty moment. I love the guy falling into the bear traps. Chekhov bear traps that we see from the beginning there, you know.
Yeah, I like the bear traps. What else did I like?
It
was the screening moment. I think that was probably the... And
you mentioned this, but what on earth happens in that trap? She picks up a pair of scissors and suddenly she's flown across a room.
So he'd identified... They were Chekhov's scissors, because he'd identified those scissors earlier. and already seen that they were connected to something, but we didn't know what they were connected to. And she just pulled the thing to find out what they were connected to. So there must have been something in the floor, or maybe she got dry. I can't quite, but she flew through the air.
Yep.
Beautiful arc. Splat, stayed up.
No one gets out of it alive. You've got that other guy who at first, the kind of the father of the household, who is alive seemingly at the beginning. Next time we see him, he's been like gutted and hung upside down, right? It's like
entrails
everywhere. It's absolute nightmare. Arkin manages to get out of the house, but then looks up in an upstairs window and sees the little girl who's still up there, right? This little girl who's going to need a lifetime of therapy, FYI, but let's not think about that. But yes, he then goes back in, and that's where we have the big kind of showdown and everything with the killer. There's a big fight. There's a lot of horrible homophobic slurs going on. Then we get back out. How do you find the kind of the final act of this movie and how it all kind of concludes, I suppose?
So I love the fact that there is a version of the movie where he flips the bird to the kid and doesn't go back into the house.
Right. What does that mean, right? Because, this is at the 60-minute mark in the film, and the whole reason that we get the final act is because he sees that little girl and decides, no, I've got to go back in the house and save her, and then we get that final act. But yeah, like you said, there is this deleted scene where instead of that, he flips off the little girl and just goes home. And it's like, well, what did they expect was going to happen in that original cut? That was the film just going to end there?
Would he have just left?
Yeah.
Yes, he would have just gone. That was him. He's got his treasure. He'll take it, and that's fine.
Yeah.
The idea that the third act is actually a moral responsibility choice that he endures.
Yes.
Do you know, the thing is, the movie is at such a roller coaster pace. I mean, 20 minutes in, I think exactly 20 minutes in, he's unlocking the door to the front of the house. Yeah. And that's, so you are in that house for that entire time. And I think there's always that moment, and we see it in a lot of these movies, and we also see it in Don't Breathe, where the character gets out of the house and realises that they have to go back in. And everyone that is watching, you have that moment, that lovely moment of horror going, no, don't do that. Don't make that choice. But they always have a reason to make that choice.
Yes.
So you can see why he went in.
Of course.
And do you know what? It was pretty roller coaster in there too. There was a TV being dropped in a fish tank for electrocuting someone.
Even the fish perish in this film. The dogs, the cats, and the fish.
Can we take a moment for that cat trap?
Oh
That's
my god,
horrible.
we should talk about the cat actually, because what on earth is that? It's like a kind of acid glue type stuff all over the floor, right? And the cat gets stuck to it, and it really drags out this scene where obviously it's not real, but it's really awful to watch this cat struggling and crying stuck to that kind of acid, right? That has to be like peeled off, and then it goes to escape out the window and then gets sliced in half.
Gets halved. And I think that's us even describing that, right?
Yes.
While it's obviously disgusting and horrible, and I can't possibly imagine.
For cat owners out there everywhere, I should have done a trigger warning before even talking about it. It's horrible.
But it is so heightened. The idea that even the cat gets halved. That's how ludicrous it is. So you can see it through two different lenses. You can see it through the bleak, depraved, nasty, horrible, which it totally is. Not defending any of that, but also at the same time, the trigger to laugh when the ludicrous things happen is still very strong. And I think that says more about us as people, Mike.
100%. I went from really squirming and being genuinely troubled by that moment of the cat in distress to then laughing out loud at the moment when he got sliced in half. Because you just go, right, okay, this is what this film is. It is going to be as gross and mean-spirited as possible. Okay, fine, I'm in. Give it to me,
Yeah. It's realise it, because any other, I did not appreciate animal death in anything ever.
No.
Ever. I don't think there's really ever a moment where it's excused. The film would have been fine without it.
Yes.
But it was very much...
That didn't need to be in there.
It was unnecessary. But the fact that it is there is just further proof of how it's absurd.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absurd.
I've talked about this before this series, but it's the subgenre where even the children and the animals are not safe, right? Home invasion, the pets and the kids are not safe. This is the thing. And this movie really exemplifies that. And then, of course, we get the moment where we think everything's done. He gets into the ambulance. And then we have that tremendous ambulance crash from inside the ambulance, right? With a kind of anti-gravity moment. I thought that was quite a fun final sequence too,
That was fun. I
was into it.
That was fun. A nice, it's a serious sting in the tail. Yeah. And the thing is, I guess it had to make sense that way, didn't it? The movie was so mean-spirited.
Yes.
that it would not have done. I mean, yes, the girl was safe.
Exactly.
But that's all they're giving you. That's it.
Yeah.
You know, that's as far as they're going to go.
Exactly. I think that works. I think that works for the overall theme of the film.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. We'll let the little girl go. Everyone else is fair game, basically, including our main character. Yeah. It's a lot of fun, right? The movie did actually pretty well. It was made for $3 million, and I think it made 3 times its budget in cinemas. And then it did really, really well on home video. Just not well enough for either me or you to know about it for some reason. But
this is a problem. This is an us problem. This is not the movie's problem.
Exactly. And I think you're right. I think I would have written off a film like this at the time as being like, okay, this is another one of those movies, which I'm not particularly into, you know? And I think I probably, even if I'd seen pictures of it, I may have just thought, I'll get to that eventually, maybe, and never did.
I do think there is something inherently attractive about this kind of concept, though. Especially like now. I mean, we're all obsessed with escape rooms, all of these things, and there are variations of this. You know, I mean, what's that? Haunt, the one that was written by the guys that made A Quiet Place.
Yes.
You know, these types of movies. They all have a shared DNA.
Absolutely.
And I think...
and there's something about the fact that enough time has passed now since the 2000s horror that I watched this, having never seen it, being like, oh, wow, this is like a real throwback. And I almost felt kind of nostalgic about that era of horror, you know?
And we both have... Not sponsored at all by Philips Hue, but we both have Philips Hue, and that film was green.
Oh, my whole living room was
so
green for 80 minutes. It was great.
Yeah. So green. I love this.
I think it holds up well in a way. I mean, apart from some of the horrible slurs in it, and apart from the fact that it looks like it's a new metal music video, I think it's still basically a fun, trashy piece of entertainment, isn't it? Really?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I love that grain on stuff as well. That grain that'll take me far.
Yes,
really.
It was shot on 16mm film, which again, like quite unusual, I think, for a 2009 movie, right? As well, it wasn't shot on digital or anything as well. And you can really feel that when you watch it, can't you?
Can.
Yeah. It's great. Now, there is a sequel, which I've also heard good things about. I've had people comment on social media to be like, oh, I love the sequel even more than the original, called The Collection. Have you yet had a chance to see The Collection, Louise?
No, because I rewatched The Collector instead.
Same.
The fact that I watched it twice within about a month period says the fact that I was like, oh, I'll just watch it again. Just keep it fresh. So that it's still oozing.
I know. And I did the same thing. I thought I could watch The Collection or I could watch The Collector again. And I thought I should probably do my homework and watch The Collector a second time. Yeah. But I am actually quite intrigued. I think I'm going to give The Collection a watch at some point, right?
It's also got, I think, the same cast.
Yes.
I think.
So
Similar.
It's the same director, Marcus Dunstan, same writers, Patrick Melton and Marcus Dunstan, and then we've got Arkin back as well. Interesting.
It's in his box, clearly.
So what I've heard from reviews and descriptions is that it's very much the Aliens to the first film, in that it's bigger, schlockier. Apparently, it's about Arkin getting together a bunch of other big, burly people with weapons to go into the lair of the Collector to kill him. And
I want to watch this
various
immediately.
Grisly traps ensue. So it's kind of like get a bunch of Marines in, very expendable Marines, and kill them off, basically. Fine.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. I'm into it. And apparently there's going to be another movie, right? There's some sort of third movie in development as well.
I was reading, I think it's something to do with COVID putting things on hold and stuff.
Yeah.
I think from what I can gather, The Collected. Is it The Collected?
So we've got The Collector, The Collection, and then the third one is going to be called The Collected, apparently.
Should be The Collectioning. Why is it not The Collectioning? But no, I'm gonna watch The Collection, Mike.
Yeah, I am as well. I'm officially in on this franchise now. Yeah. I'm going to have to check it out. Maybe one day we'll do a little Patreon bonus where we can talk about The Collection once we've had a chance to see it. Let's do it. Well, there you go. That is the brilliant The Collector from 2009. What a pleasant, fun surprise that movie was for both Louise and I.
Yes.
Happy, happy Halloween, 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 happy, happy Halloween, silver shamrock.
Guys, I could not resist playing that annoyingly catchy catchy little ditty from Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, because I don't know about you guys, but I'm feeling very much like the spooky season is soon upon us. You know, summer is coming to an end. It's that time of year. We're going to be walking through crunchy leaves, and we're getting ready for a lot of very fun horror-based antics through the month of October. And oh my god, have we got a lot of exciting stuff happening through the month of October. If you guys head on over to evolutionofhorror.com/events, you will see that there are tickets available for several different very exciting events we've got happening all over the UK in the month of October. I'm going to quickly run through them now and let you know which ones still have tickets available. So, on Monday, the 2nd of October, I am going to be in Oxford as a special guest at the Cinema Under the Stairs Shocktober Festival, and I'm going to be hosting and introducing a special screening of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors, which, of course, as many of you know, is one of my favourite slasher movies of all time. I cannot wait to see it on the big screen. I've never seen it on the big screen, so I am going to be there in attendance, introducing the film. Come and hang out with us if you are in the Oxford area. I believe there are less than 10 tickets available for that, so it's gonna sell out soon. So if you want to come along, please grab your ticket while you can. A few days later, from the 5th of October to the 8th of October, we're going to be at Grimfest in Manchester. This is one of the best UK-based horror festivals of the year. They're going to be screening 15 films across 3 days, and we are going to be there, me, Becky Dark, Brad Hanson, and a bunch of other friends of the pod. Adam Robinson, Rob Watts is going to be there. We are all going to be hanging out across that whole weekend, hosting various different screenings and events, including a special opening night horror pub quiz. We're going to be hosting that on the 5th of October, the night before the festival really kicks off. And we're going to be hosting a few screenings and panel discussions throughout as well. So if you want details of that, head on over to our events page. Meanwhile, the next day, on Monday the 9th of October, I'm going to be in Liverpool at the Fact Picture House Cinema, and we are going to be hosting a special screening of Child's Play from 1988. Oh my god, the original Chucky masterpiece. We're going to be screening that, and it's going to be followed by a special live panel discussion, which is going to be recorded as a live podcast. So please, if you're in the Liverpool area, come along, grab your ticket now, and join us for a night of Chucky antics. I absolutely cannot wait for that. A couple of nights later, the 11th of October, I'm going to be in Edinburgh, hosting a special screening, again, a 35th anniversary screening of David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers. That's going to be screened on 35mm at the Cameo Cinema in Edinburgh. A beautiful cinema. I absolutely cannot wait to see that stunning David Cronenberg film on the big screen. And that one is also going to be followed by a live panel discussion recorded as a live podcast. Couple of nights after that, the 13th of October, that's Friday the 13th, I'm going to be in Newcastle at the Tyneside Cinema hosting a screening of Sleepaway Camp for its 40th anniversary. Holy shit, cannot wait. That's going to be followed by a live panel discussion of the film. After that, the following night, the 14th of October, I'm going to be at the City Screen Cinema in York, and we're going to be screening Don't Look Now for its 50th anniversary, followed by a very special panel discussion with special guests. The following night, the 15th of October, I'm going to be shattered. The 15th of October, we're going to be hosting a screening of Rope at the Hyde Park Picture House in Leeds. Beautiful cinema, stunning film. That's going to be at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, again followed by a special panel discussion with special guests. A few days later in Reading, we're going to be hosting a special 50th anniversary screening of William Friedkin's The Exorcist at the Reading Biscuit Factory Cinema. Cannot wait for that one. That one's going to be hosted by my very good friend Becky Dark. Meanwhile, in London on the same night, the 19th of October, I am going to be hosting a very special screening of Haxan, the silent classic, and it's going to be accompanied by a live organ accompaniment. That's going to be at the Regent Street Cinema in London, followed by a special panel discussion of the film with guests that include Kim Newman, Pamela Hutchinson, and James Swanton. It's going to be so much fun. On the 29th of October, also at the London Regent Street Cinema, we're going to be screening the silent classic Phantom of the Opera, starring Lon Chaney. That is also going to have a live organ accompaniment. I'm so excited for this one, and it's going to be followed by a panel discussion with brilliant, clever guests Kevin Lyons, James Swanton, and Becky Dark. And then finally, last but not least, on Halloween night, Monday the 31st of October, we're going to be doing our first ever live show, a full 60-minute live recording at the Old Red Lion Theatre, which, FYI, is one of the spookiest and most haunted theatres in London. And I'm going to be joined on stage by Becky Dark, Brad Hanson, and Stevie Webb for a very special one-time live event. This one is not going to be recorded. It is going to be purely a live show, and we've got some really fun stuff planned for that one. And there are only, at the time of recording this, about 5 tickets left. So please get in there quickly. Grab yourself a ticket if you are in London or within reach of London and you want something fun to do on Halloween night. Join us for our first ever full live show, The Evolution of Horror Live. That's 9 p.m. at the Old Red Lion Theatre in London. So if you want to grab tickets to any of these numerous spooky and exciting events we've got happening across the UK in October, then head on over to our events page to get tickets. evolutionofhorror.com/events. That's evolutionofhorror.com/events. All right, let's hurtle into the second half of this week's episode as Louise Blain and I discuss Fede Alvarez's terrifying and ludicrous Don't Breathe from 2016.
1837 Buena Vista Street. House is with your dad's security company, I already checked. Guy who owns it is an Army vet loner. No family, just him in the house.
That part of the city is a ghost town.
It looks like a dump.
That's actually good news.
How's that good news?
Well, story goes, some preppy girl a few years ago ran over this guy's daughter.
Jesus.
Daughter dies, and this preppy, rich-ass family pays him off. Gives him a big-ass settlement.
Settlement.
Blow me, Your Honor. All right? This guy is sitting on at least $300K. Boom! I mean, if I deliver this steak to Raul, man, he will shit his pants.
Do you think the money's in the house?
I don't know. Let's go find out.
Guys, no. We don't do cash. Above 10K, it's major larceny. That means 10 years if we get caught.
We won't get caught.
Okay, and then what? That amount brings a serious cop presence. I'll do an investigation. My dad could get in trouble.
You'd bitch out, man. Just knew it.
Alex, if we do this right, we never have to do it again.
So 3 desperate, I think they're 20-somethings looking for cash. They've been doing multiple break-ins, and they discover that an ex-Marine who is living in a terrible area, which is basically abandoned and quite a nice house. They've basically, they've said that they wanted to have a nice house in a bad area instead of a bad house in a nice area, purposefully.
Yes.
They discover that he lost his daughter and was then given a payout of thousands of dollars because of that. And they decided that he would be sitting on it, so they would basically go into his house and steal the money and get out. And what they discover is that despite the fact that the man is blind, he can more than hold his own.
Indeed.
But also, there's something else in the house that will just make things even more interesting and diabolical.
Oh my God, there's so much to talk about. So much to talk about, right? First of all, Louise, what is your history with this movie? I'm guessing you were aware of this movie when it came out in 2016.
I watched this on release in cinema.
Yeah.
Fede Alvarez, I'm a very big fan of Fede Alvarez's movies. I loved his Evil Dead. And I think it was day one for Don't Breathe for me.
Yeah.
And I think it has moments that we'll go into later, but I think it is a exceptionally tightly directed thriller that has moments of perfection.
Yes.
In it.
Yes. Completely agree with you. I saw this at a press screening in 2016 and I loved it. First time coming out of it, I loved it. And there are a few issues with the story. We'll get to them, right? But generally, as an exercise in sheer suspense, right? I think for me, this is Fede Alvarez's best movie. I think that the direction is brilliant. I love this claustrophobic cat and mouse thriller, the way it goes all the way back to movies we've covered on this series, like Wait Until Dark, with this blind person in the house, to People Under the Stairs again, to everything else that's come since. But yeah, I think it is such a brilliant balance of like just edge of your seat suspense with brilliant jump scares and a bit of nasty violence and great characters too, where you don't know quite who you're rooting for in this movie as well. Well, maybe until the final act, where it makes it a little bit easier to know who to root for. Yes.
I think that I do think the moral interplay of this is the idea of this trio of people who are clearly all very different. So there's Dylan Minnette, Jane Levy is Rocky, and we have their objectionable friend.
Yes.
Who we know is objectionable. Money? Yes,
we know he's objectionable because his name's Money.
His name's Money. He's completely objectionable, and that's the kind of, when we see the first break-in that they do, like he's pissing all over the house. He's willfully disregarding. He's not just there to steal, he's there to make a statement.
Oh, he is the douchebag that dies first.
He's the complete asshole. He's the person that you're like, do you know what? See, when you go into this house, you deserve exactly what's coming to you because you're an asshole.
Yeah.
I think that's, but even then, like, I actually think the characterization of all these characters is really interesting, because obviously they all want out for different reasons.
Yes.
And I think there's a scene of Money he's done the first break-in, and he's in this warehouse, like taking these things to this guy who's buying the stuff.
Yeah.
And the guy's like, oh, you can have this much. And Money's like, oh, are you kidding? Like, there was a Rolex. He's like, what am I going to do? Put it on sale at Sotheby's. And there's this idea that he can't get out either. He can't catch a break either. He just wants the money. And although he's objectionable about it and he is a total ass.
Yes.
There is enough there that says that he is, again, morally desperate enough to do what they're doing. So actually, while, I was saying at the start that I previously was just like, anyone that wants to do these things deserves it. Mm-hmm. This is a film that investigates the morality behind all of it, the layers of it. Everybody has a story.
Absolutely.
I mean, even the man in the house,
yep.
He morally thinks he's doing the right thing with what he's doing.
Right.
And there's also, it brings in the law, because he says, well, you've brought in a gun, so he now has permission to shoot us, which brings in this extra layer of law to the situation as well. So it's just a giant moral soup. Mm-hmm. And I think Fede Alvarez very carefully, most of the time, deftly manages to find his way across this soup.
Yes.
Quite well.
Completely agree with everything you just said. I think that is one of the things that works so well about it, is that, and it's very economical, because at the 15-minute mark, we're in the house, breaking into the house, right? But just that first 15 minutes, it gives you enough about those three characters, like you say, to know that they are all desperate in different ways, and you get it. You get why they're doing what they're doing. And then initially, you also get why this poor blind veteran is acting the way that he's acting too, right?
Yeah,
initially.
Of course.
And that moral tightrope that it walks throughout the first hour of the movie, I think, is so interesting. I think where it falls down a little bit is when it's then, like we said, it makes it a little bit more black and white as to who is the bad guy and who is the good guy, right?
Yes.
But, I think we'll go into that, of course, but I think overall, it's a really well-made movie. Like, I do think it's a very, very well-directed, well-crafted cat and mouse thriller, right? It's great. It's great fun.
Yeah.
Where do we start? Maybe let me just start by asking you, we've jumped forward 7 years to 2016 here. Does this feel to you like we're now in a different era of horror filmmaking compared to The Collector in 2009?
I think very much so, and I think for a couple of reasons. In the early 2010s, we had a lot of supernatural movies. We had a lot of demons, we had quite a lot of possession, we had a lot of hauntings. And we also, Fede Alvarez obviously made The Evil Dead. He's making something literally drenched in gore. And I think he'd said that he wanted to make something much more human, a much more human thriller. And I think coming into 2016, that is the kind of, again, we know what we're watching. We still get a high concept, super tight thriller.
Yes.
And I think there's a lot of comparisons in how it treats the house. You end up again in the walls, you end up falling out of windows. It's all about doors that you almost leave, but you can't, because you have to go back in, because morally you can't leave the person in there behind. So there's actually a lot of similarities where you're like, oh, these are the same inherently, you put someone in a house, there's only so many ways that you can do it.
Yeah.
But it's so inventive about the way that everybody interacts that it feels genuine for those those character motivations.
Yeah, agreed.
Mostly.
I think we're pushing into this era of, I don't know, whatever you'd want to call it, kind of just slightly more socially aware horror.
Yes,
I suppose,
absolutely.
we're 1 year out from Get Out. This is the kind of similar era to The Witch, where it's like, it's not just making a really brilliant scary movie, it's also exploring something. And obviously horror has always done that. But I think, it became such an important element of horror from about 2014, 2015 onwards, didn't it, I think?
Yeah, that you're going to say something.
Yes, exactly. And this movie does in a lot of ways, as we've already discussed. Like, I think there is a really interesting element of that. But it's also got a really fun, it's not necessarily what people might label quote unquote elevated horror either, right? It doesn't feel like a Robert Eggers or Ari Aster movie. It feels like a Fede Alvarez movie. It's a roller coaster of jumps and tension and schlock and violence and everything else as well, isn't it? I think.
And as you say, it's so claustrophobic and so tight.
Yes.
There's literally scenes in small hallways and tiny corridors, and I think the way that, and we'll talk about it later, is the fact, and I'm bringing up John Wick again, is the way that that he is with them. Mm-hmm. He's very strong, but he still has limitations, so they can still, unlike the assassin in John Wick, who literally can assassinate everybody like he can see, the blind assassin, who is incredible, but it's that kind of, there is a believability in his knowledge of his environment. At one point when he's chasing them, he's touching the pipes overhead, so he knows where he is in his own basement. It's about, that he knows the inside of his house like the back of his hand, and they are trapped in there with him. And I think even that knowledge is very, very intelligent throughout.
I completely agree. And there's been a really interesting trend. This is something we've talked about throughout this season too, of sort of differently abled people being targeted in these movies, right? And this is an interesting subversion of that. I mean, you go back to The Spiral Staircase, was about a mute woman in the 1940s. You had Wait Until Dark with Audrey Hepburn, about a blind woman in her flat being invaded. And then you have Hush, of course, in 2016, about a deaf woman experiencing a home invasion. And this is... And in those scenarios, those are all the protagonists, right? They're the target of the home invasion. Whereas this movie is kind of a fun subversion of that in a lot of ways, I think, isn't it? Where it's like, don't underestimate this person.
Yeah, he is powerful, and understandably so.
Yeah.
It's like, don't assume anything just because people aren't exactly the same as you.
Exactly.
It's that exact trap that these characters fall into, and it's like, yes, do not assume.
And these three kids too, they do really feel like kids, don't they? And I think I quite appreciate that about it too, because I think there is this other element too of, if these were three burglars in their 30s, I think maybe we'd feel less sympathy for them, right? Than we do. The older I get, the more that teenagers in films really do look like children, right? Unless they're played by 30-somethings.
Which still occasionally happens.
Which still happens occasionally. But what do you think of these three lead performances? Jane Levy, who of course was in Evil Dead, wasn't she? She was, and then Dylan Minnette, who has become a bit of a horror star in recent years
Scream,
too, right? And Daniel Savato, who actually I didn't realise until I looked it up. He was in It Follows, and I actually interviewed him for It Follows, but he's one of the main teens in that film too. Three great actors in this movie, right? What do you think of them?
I really like them. Like, I think it's that thing of, you have to make them believable and you have to make them justifiable. I mean, Rocky's situation with her horrible home situation where she wants to save her sister and get her sister out, and we see it in quite a small, but she's an exceptionally likable protagonist, and the fact that someone is still a likable protagonist when they're convincing someone to, disregard someone's security system and go in to rob them is quite the thing. But I do think, as we said earlier about money, like, he's there for us to hate almost. Even with the added sort of moralistic elements, he is, as you say, the first to die in a very shocking moment.
Oh my God, it's brutal, that moment. I think that's the other thing too, is that while The Collector sort of feels like it's so over the top that you can almost playing it for laughs, this movie feels like it's taking what it's doing deadly seriously, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. You can feel the weight of that first death when he gets shot, right? And the shock of it,
Okay, I swear to God.
because it's quiet. It's quite a quiet movie, and it very much focuses on the noise of the sound of a gun being reloaded or a key or all of these things. You suddenly become hyper aware of these little movements. And there's a lovely, in that hall sequence, there's some beautiful direction where they're kind of arguing over how to get into this door.
Yes.
And the camera swings round and he's behind them. He's there. And you get this drop in your stomach. And it had already happened about 5 minutes before when Money had gone into the room and tried to drug him. And again, he sat up and you get this immediate dread where you're immediately like, this is the cat and mouse and I am here for it. But the moment where he arrives in the hall is just so tense. So tense.
And let's talk about those swooping camera movements as well, because Fede Alvarez as a director, he's got so much style. I think you can see that in Evil Dead 2013, of course, and in this movie too, right? What do you think of the way in which he kind of moves his camera around in this film?
There's such a confidence to it. There's such a movement to it as well, and it happens a lot that he's moving with the characters, because there's a moment where after he shot him, Dylan Minnett's characters come back into the hall, and suddenly these characters meet in the middle but without the shot changing, so it's this one panicked shot of him standing against a wall and trying to get out of the way, when it was you thought it was one character's shot, but actually it was both, and it was an almost interaction, so you see the way that the characters sit in the space without him cutting to them.
Yes.
So it's constantly like you're constantly on the back foot, because you're not actually quite sure of their positioning compared to him, and he wants you to feel that because they're not sure of it either. They don't know if he can see them or can't see them. So there's this constant back and forth of who's where and what difference does it make. Like, that's constant.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's this almost kind of omniscient kind of vibe to the camera at times. Like, it, while the collector is quite sort of choppy in that new metal video type of way, there is, like you said, long takes in this movie. And there's that great sequence, I think it's about a 2-minute single take when they first get into the house, where they are kind of wandering from room to room and the camera is gliding around, and it gives us kind of a lot of information that we need to know for later on in the film. Like, we will see the bells hanging from the ceiling. We will see certain rooms and certain spaces. And I think there's a really clever thing he does. We talked about this with, famously, David Fincher does this with Panic Room too, right? He gives you the kind of tour of the house. Like, we're sort of gliding around it from room to room before the action kicks off. But I think all of that, it looks great, doesn't it? I think it works so well.
I love that when any filmmaker decides to give you the geography of where you are, so that you have a positioning, so that you know the rules of that space, so that when the characters break those rules or find new places, you go on that journey with them. But you almost feel slightly forewarned. Like, there's definitely a relationship there that they take advantage of.
What about the house itself? We talked about this big old mansion in The Collector. How do you find the production design of this particular house in comparison?
Well, we have another big mansion, don't we? We have another big house.
Yeah.
It's all corridors and
it's sort of
extra
bigger
doors.
than it looks from the outside, this one, right? Yeah.
And some kind of double basement, because there's the regular basement and then there's the basement where our third act reveal sits, or even second act reveal, actually. Like, it keeps going.
It keeps going. It actually reminded me a lot, rewatching it, it reminded me a lot of one of our favourite recent sort of home invasion movies, Barbarian, which, of course, both movies set in Detroit, both set on these abandoned streets where every other house on the street is abandoned and derelict, and you've got this one house with secret dark stuff going on and a big basement that feels way too big for what the house suggests, and
the way that, just like in Barbarian, nobody cares if a gunfire goes off. There's a shot from outside the house when they think that they're about to get, again, another lovely surprise. If they think they're about to get out of the basement, they've managed to unlock the door. He's there. He's got a gun. And you see the flash of the muzzle up against this other house, but you already know that this is an empty street. Like, you're like, it doesn't matter. Now people are firing guns, and it doesn't matter. No one's here.
Yeah,
this is a house.
Exactly, because even in that shot that feels such a classic kind of final moment of a horror film, where the final girl comes bursting out of the house, she's escaped, it's daylight, and you think, well, it's daylight now, surely somebody can help her, and of course there is not a single soul around, right? And she ends up back inside that house again. It's great. That, again, there is a kind of it's not really, it feels like there's enough of a kind of glimpse of a kind of social commentary there to that too, in this kind of rundown area of Detroit, right, as well. But also just works as a great backdrop to this particular story, and how it's just like, they really are, there is no one around that can help them. Okay,
let's get out of here.
The storm's all door. Doors bolted from the inside. That could be our way out. Let's go.
So the suspense, we've talked about this a little bit already, but like that first hour before we get down to the basement, of just them hiding, of them walking past each other in rooms, of this blind man slowly starting to realize how many people are in his house, etc. How do you find that, and the way in which the kind of suspense is built here?
I think it's perfect. You know, I think it might be. I think it the fact when they realize how trapped they are, that he goes around and he locks all the doors and he relocks everything and he fastens them in. You know, we see him crouching in the bathroom while he's sort of sorting out the bathroom window, so there is no escape. Like, the fact that we get to be a part of that, but also excuse me, the fact that we see him, he has the money. The money exists. I think that's a really interesting thing. Like, we see the money. He goes to the safe. He checks the safe. He doesn't know that she can see him putting in the numbers. So again, that ups the stakes, because all of a sudden she still does the robbery.
Yes.
You know, I think it's the fact that, I think there's a couple of moments in the movie actually where she takes the money, he realizes the money is gone and is now furious because he now knows that they're in there and they've taken his cash. But there's a point where the two of them have managed to escape up to the room upstairs, and he says, here's the way that we can fix this. We can bring the cops. Yeah. And she literally, with the blind man hammering on the door outside, they know he's already killed their pal. She says, but we won't get away with the money.
Yeah.
And I was like, you're still arguing about the money. Like, you might leave this in a body bag.
Right.
But you're still so desperate for that money that she then clambers into the, air conditioning ducts, where she is then followed by a dog.
God.
Again, that's more of... The tension is a different kind of tension for the second and third act.
Yes.
Because it's almost, again, that series of unfortunate events thing from The Collector, where suddenly it becomes a thrill ride.
Yes.
Instead of what was potentially a super tight thriller. It does change tack.
Agreed. It becomes a bit more of a fun
through.
House of horrors almost, doesn't it, at that point? Yeah, you're absolutely right. And actually we haven't really talked about him yet, but Stephen Lang as the blind man as well. Like, I think Stephen Lang's quite a famous actor, of course. He's famous for playing a lot of kind of like big, burly, military type characters. He was the baddie from the Avatar movies, right? Yeah. He's the guy that we all hate in the Avatar movies. But yeah, he does a great job in this, I think, too, doesn't he? Like, I think particularly in the first hour, you can feel there is a vulnerability to him as well as a real strength, and a real, madness potentially too,
Yeah. I mean, it's a great performance. I mean, I think as well, like, before we know what he's doing in the basement, I was kind of, fully invested in, they get what's coming to them. They've just come into your house. Yeah. Like, sure, especially that guy. That guy will pay for what he's decided to disregard. So the push-pull of morality of the heroes and anti-hero there is completely blurred and messy, and I love that. And I am almost, and I think that's where I slightly feel it falls down, even though I understand why it is, that when we discover that he's actually a bad man with capital B, it's almost like that's how we're going to justify the fact that it's okay to steal his money.
Totally. It gives us all a bit of an easy way out, doesn't it?
Permission.
It takes away any kind of moral ambiguity there, I think. Let's get to it, shall we? So we get to eventually our main characters get into the basement. And this big sprawling basement with this secret room that appears to be filled with plants. And then when they turn on some lights, there is a kind of evil lair where we've got a woman gagged and tied up who's been abducted, essentially, right? And then, of course, we get this sort of backstory that is revealed that his daughter was killed in a hit and run, I think, by this woman.
Yep.
He is...
Yep.
then essentially kidnapping her in order to essentially impregnate her, right? Inseminate her with his sperm via turkey baster because he feels that she owes him a daughter or owes him a child, basically, right? So, yeah, this is where he becomes real. Oh, he's a proper monster. He's a rapist, abductor, murderer monster. Okay, fine. What do you think of this reveal?
I think it's interesting because actually thinking a lot about it, this is effectively a movie about everybody taking the law into their own hands because they feel like they've been hard done by. So our central characters don't have any money. Their societal situation means that they are stuck in horrible situations where they're trying to make the best of it and they can't. They can't get out of their societal situation, so they decide that they need money. They figure this guy has it, that would be an easy fix, so they go in there, only to find someone who has been hard done by the world. His daughter was killed. This rich woman was the one that killed her. Rich girls don't spend time in prison because the world fails again in terms of doling out justice. So he feels like he is owed a daughter. And his way of getting a daughter is this. And he very much focuses on, he says that there is no, he's talking about a God and the fact that once you realise there is no God, and it's almost like all of these characters have rejected the idea of there being a God. No one's going to save them but themselves. Yeah. So this is on a zoomed out level. No one is coming to save you. Make your own fucking luck. But he's decided that he's going to play God, but he doesn't see it that way. So actually, everybody here, other than the police car, which zooms up at the end, very much, I'll come and fix this. These people cannot be fixed by this. Morally, it's too messy. And I find that fascinating because suddenly you then go, well, of course that is diabolical, but he thinks that's a great idea.
It's such a good point.
He thinks it's what the world owes him. Yeah. And as disgusting as, it's appalling and foul the way, the hair on the turkey baster when he wants to do it to her, I'm like, the hair, I can't cope with the hair, which...
So you're of course talking about the fact that we see this little pot of semen that he keeps in the fridge that he uses to impregnate women, right? We get this kind of really grotesque close-up of the semen and it has a little pubic hair in it. It's just added for effect, right?
Well, apparently it was one of the crew members' hairs that Fede Alvarez put in.
Oh, God.
And also, I don't know, take from this what you will. Fede Alvarez says that he used what they use in the X-rated film industry for what was in the beaker. Oh. So does that mean it was actually biological?
Oh yeah, because you'd think in the adult film industry that's all
the
real,
adult film industry,
right?
That's real. That's real. That is.
It can't be.
Au natural.
It can't be.
You couldn't have thought so.
No.
Surely not. They would never have.
Maybe for certain. Maybe for certain.
I can't. It's
maybe
vile.
for certain films in the adult film genre, they need extra fake stuff. Yeah. That, maybe there is some sort of formula to create that kind of stuff that he followed.
A formula. Yes, a formula. A very simple formula.
I love it. But yes, it goes.
Vile.
This is the thing, right? I don't know. I can't work out if this is a problem for me or not. But this is, of course, where I do begin to laugh at this film. This is where I am broken out of this is a taut, slick, very smart, very scary, stripped back exercise in suspense horror movie into now I'm in The Collector, now I'm in torture porn, now I am laughing and slightly rolling my eyes when we have a pot full of semen, a turkey baster, a pube, a woman tied up, okay, here we go, this is now getting very silly,
Yes, it totally changes the whole mood of it.
Yes.
And it is then it becomes immediately gross. You're immediately like, oh, there's the shot, which is just of the baster, which is slightly full, just heading towards her. There's some really, and then he ends up with, she jams it in his mouth.
In his mouth! Oh, that is grim, that scene as well, isn't it?
But it's, no less than he deserves for what he'd been about to do, but
absolutely.
It's a whole section that is just... It's like it's in a different movie. And I do understand why it's here. I get it.
Sure, absolutely.
I get it.
Yes.
Almost.
Yes. And it's very hard to sustain a whole runtime of just what we got in that first half, you know?
Totally.
Like,
You gotta
I
up the
get
stakes.
it.
You gotta up them.
Up the stakes. But it does just get more and more
a
mad
baster.
from this point onwards, doesn't it? It gets more and more mad. But I do love the visual choices of what we get in that basement when it goes fully pitch black.
Yes.
And instead of getting the kind of night vision, we get this kind of grey scale view of the characters wandering around in the dark, right? And again, actually, weirdly linked to The Collector, those two actors that were, you know, Dylan Minnette and Jane Levy, we get shots of them wandering around in the dark and their eyes look kind of black like you'd get on infrared, right? But actually they were wearing black contacts and again were completely unable to see during those sequences. So they really were stumbling around,
in the dark,
not able to see anything in those sequences. And I think that you can sort of see there's that extra layer of fear and panic on them, I think, in those sequences.
And I remember seeing them in the cinema for the first time and just being like, this is exciting. You know, because there were just these shots facing them as well, which adds to the panic because you can't see where they're going. They can't see where they're going, but their pursuer knows where he is at all times, you know, so it's adding that moment of just the shot of him turning off the lights, the mains, and you're just like, oh shit.
It's so good. And yeah, Fede Alvarez is a really great visual director. You know, I think of those scenes in Evil Dead where everything goes blood red and everything, right? And yeah, the visual choices in this movie too are really cool. Like the sort of thing we just haven't seen before, considering this kind of setup has been done a lot, you know? Yeah, it's very, very cool. And then how did you find it? Again, like, it does do this thing. We've talked about it briefly already, but we're not quite at the 88-minute runtime yet, and so we get out of the house, but then we get the whole sort of Cujo sequence in the car, right, where she is chased by the dog, and then we end up back in the house and everything. How do you find that kind of last act?
I find that, in one side, I find it quite relentless, because it doesn't slow down at all. You know, when she gets out of the house and she's like, you can't do anything now, I'm here, and you get these giant, like, zoomed out shots where suddenly the world seems huge. You know, the world is enormous.
I love those shots.
And yet we're just in, you know, there's horrible warehouses. There's nowhere to run, as you said earlier, because nobody lives here. I did find the dog sequence really protracted.
Yes.
I mean, the noise of the dog is terrifying. And
it is a scary sequence, but it did. I mean, Fede Alvarez said in interviews, he was like, I think I unconsciously kind of took inspiration from Cujo. I was like, unconsciously? I mean, it's the most Cujo scene since Cujo.
There's a lot of slobber and a lot of drool. A lot all over the windows. But I love how she traps the dog in the boot. Or the trunk of the car.
It's great.
I do think that's very smart. I think it's, again, one of those like escape room type puzzles where you're like, well, what's she going to do? She can't get, there's no keys in that traditional movie place under the...
Totally.
Does anyone actually leave their keys?
Under the little visor. Yeah.
Under the visor.
Absolutely not. Who would do that?
And yet, how many movies have been saved by that?
So true.
And everyone going, logically, like, it's one of those tropes that just happens everywhere.
Yes, well, in every car it's under the visor, and on the porch of every house there's one above the door there, you know.
Or potentially, if you're feeling a bit brave, under like one of those rocks.
Yes, under a rock.
Exactly,
yeah.
It's like, no wonder home invasion happens.
Oh my God. But yes, I do think that scene, although it's a little bit like, I feel a bit like they are trying to get the runtime up to 80 minutes or more.
Yeah.
I actually do think that scene is, again, well directed. Like you said, like the way she goes into the boot of the car and the plan to escape. And again, you know, you can't get much more claustrophobic than inside a car, the interior of a car. And again, the way that Fede Alvarez directs that sequence just in that tiny, tiny, tiny space is really impressive, I think. You know, I don't know whether he did this with the car, but with the house, it was all done on a set. So the exteriors were shot in Detroit for real, but then everything else was filmed in Hungary on a set. So he built these rooms in a way where he knew that he could get his camera in and out of like little nooks and crannies and crevices. And, you know, I think he designed all of that in a really clever way to make it work and make it feel claustrophobic, but in a way that he could move his camera around where there would be a wall or whatever.
And I think when you know like that it's a set, you end up with those overhead shots like The Collector or things going through walls in this, because you realise that you are again, that omnipresent, you are that force who can go through walls, who can view how this is happening in a way that the characters who are restricted can't.
Yes. And I love some of the other sequences as well, just to shout out, like, I love the bit when Dylan Minnette is on the cracking glass. It's very Jurassic Park 2, right?
Very Jurassic. So The Lost World.
The Lost World. But it's a great moment when he goes to shoot him, misses, but he shoots the glass, and so he sort of falls through. And again, there are these moments where, because the film is so tense, sometimes it doesn't even need music, but those moments of punctuation of a gunshot or somebody just bursting through a door, I leapt out of my skin a couple of times. You know, the moment when he's pointing the gun towards the two of them, he doesn't know where they are,
and then bit in the hall,
and then the phone vibrates and he shoots the phone. You know, it's just a great moment, isn't it? I think,
you know that the tension's completely racked up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So good. So there you go. I mean, like, does the film hold up for you on repeat viewings, rewatching it again for this? As you know, is it still as good for you as it was in 2016?
Oh yeah, I definitely think so. I think I see it differently, actually. I mean, it doesn't have its. I think the first time I saw it, it had such a shock factor. It had this 1-2 punch of like total tension. Oh my God, what's he doing in that basement? So it had that 1-2 punch. And I think I've watched it a couple of times over the years, actually. I've shown a few friends, and I think one friend that was particularly resistant to it was just like, this is disgusting. I was like, okay, sure. But I think rewatching it for this, I got a new appreciation of all of it, and really especially that that first act. Is just great.
Yeah, completely agree. I love it, actually. I think it's just like it's not perfect, but I think just as like a really short, taut genre exercise, under 90 minutes, great characters, great suspense, like really good scares, right? I think it works. It works really, really well. Now, it did have a sequel, right, that came out in 2021. I did not watch this sequel. Did you watch it, Louise?
No, because it redeems him. As far as I understand, and I'm not sure how I feel about redeeming him, so I haven't watched it, because I think as a character arc, I mean, obviously, I will see how I should watch it, just like I will also watch the collection. Mm-hmm. We can have a special Patreon sequel section.
That would be great. Yeah, that would be great, actually.
But yeah, I haven't yet watched, because the thing is, he's amazing. I'd love to watch him again.
I know.
So I'm intrigued.
I know, but I just had so much bad stuff about that second one that I didn't even bother seeing it. But you're right. Yes, I think what it does is it completely doesn't even mention the fact that he was abducting and impregnating women, and just makes him the poor good guy in this second movie, which I'm like, that kind of, again, ruined what I liked about the first one, to be honest, or at least the first half of the first one. So yeah, I'm more excited about watching the Collector sequel than I am about the Don't Breathe sequel. So who knew?
Me too.
Who knew? Amazing. Well, there you go. Louise, thank you so much. What a joy it's been to discuss these movies with you. And now I know that Home Invasion isn't your favourite, but do you have a favourite? Because, of course, I have to finish with that question of what is your favourite home invasion movie?
You're next.
Oh, A, great choice. B, what a lovely segue to gear me up to next week's episode, which is your
wonderful.
Next. Perfect.
There you go. I didn't do that on purpose, but yes. Anywhere where you can properly, I know, closely followed by Hush. I love Hush.
Yes. Just wonderful. I mean, Mike Flanagan, we're doing a double bill of Hush and Gerald's Game in a few weeks' time, which, my God, talk about tension. Oh, my God.
Oh, yeah. So, there are, and I like the fact that the genre, and I think what you've done with this series, and I love what you've done with this series in terms of the different types of movies that are home invasion movies and approach the genre in different ways, I think are really interesting, because I think probably a lot of listeners found this as well, that they were like, can't you just do monsters? Because I think, it's an interesting, and I think at this point in the evolution of horror, having done so many genres before, I think it was time for this.
Yes.
But I think you've approached it in a really interesting, mature, unique way, and it's been lovely to go on this journey with you. And I've got quite a few episodes to catch up on, but it's been so good to go on this journey, because it's not, as I said, it's not my genre, but this the movies treat this in very, very different ways. Not all of them are funny games.
Absolutely. So. It's not a whole series of Funny Games and The Strangers. And I think, and the idea of subgenres, we as fans create these boundaries, really, don't we? There is no right or wrong answer to what is or isn't a folk horror, or what is or isn't a, and I think that's the fun of doing this kind of stuff on this podcast, is kind of exploring, well, hang on, if a home invasion movie is just a film in which something bad happens to someone inside a home from outside the home, there's a lot of stuff that could, fall in
everything
that category,
comes in.
which has been really, really fun. So I've loved it. But we will be doing maybe something more fun and something more monstery together next time, Louise, which is going to be very exciting.
That would be exciting.
But until then, thank you so much for joining me. Let people know where they can find you, more of your work, more of your stuff, more of all the incredible, exciting things you're doing. Where can they follow you?
The best place to follow me is Twitter, now X.
Yes.
shiny_demon. I'm also the same on Instagram. But if you go over to Threads, I am Louise Blain. I have my actual name. I have shed the shiny demon, and I'm my name. But yes, I'm also on Blue Sky. But I think that's also maybe Louise Blain on that. Just if you put Louise Blain into most of them, you'll find me. If you want, you don't have to. No pressure.
Amazing, Louise. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Louise Blain. Well, I loved discussing those two movies. Who knew that The Collector was actually so much fun? Where has it been all my life? I loved getting to watch that film and finally discuss it. So I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, etc. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror Discord, or you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group, which can be found on Facebook. If you want to support this podcast and get treated to regular bonus content, then sign up to our Patreon, patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare moment, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts, as that really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then, and we finally reach the 2010s. We're on the home stretch of our home invasion series. Next week, I've got such a fun double bill. I'm going to be joined by friend of the pod, Joshua Tonks, and we are going to be discussing You're Next from 2011 and The Guest from 2014. Cannot wait. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.